The radio operator's hand trembled as he transcribed the message arriving from Berlin. It was July 1943, and somewhere along the churning front lines of the Eastern Front, a decision made in haste was about to collide with reality in the most devastating way imaginable. The message was brief, almost insultingly so given what it demanded. Advance immediately. No delays. No reconnaissance. The fate of an entire campaign rested on speed, or so the distant strategists believed. What they could not see from their war rooms hundreds of miles away was the trap that had been prepared with meticulous care, waiting with the patience of a predator that knows its prey will arrive exactly on schedule. General Werner Kempf read the orders twice, not because he misunderstood them, but because he could not quite believe what was being asked of him. His division, the pride of the Wehrmacht's armored forces, had been groomed for years to become the spearhead of German offensive operations. These were not conscripts or hastily assembled reserves. These were professionals who had trained together, fought together, and survived the grinding campaigns across Poland, France, and deep into Soviet territory. Their tanks represented the finest engineering the Reich could produce, machines that had earned fearful respect from every enemy they encountered. And now, without aerial reconnaissance, without proper intelligence about what lay ahead, without even the basic courtesy of time to prepare, he was being ordered to throw them forward into unknown terrain against an enemy that had proven itself increasingly cunning with each passing month. The pressure from above had been building for weeks. The summer offensive that German high command had planned with such confidence was beginning to falter. Delays had accumulated. Resources had been diverted. The Soviets, who were supposed to collapse under the weight of German armor and tactical superiority, had instead absorbed blow after blow and remained standing. Worse, they seemed to be learning from their mistakes with a speed that troubled even the most arrogant German commanders. Every week that passed saw Soviet defensive positions grow more sophisticated, their artillery coordination improve, their understanding of how to blunt German armored thrusts deepen. The window of opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, was closing with the finality of a coffin lid. Kempf understood the strategic situation well enough. He knew that Berlin was desperate for a breakthrough, for some dramatic success that could justify the enormous commitment of men and resources being poured into this offensive. He knew that other units had failed to achieve their objectives, that the carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling piece by piece, and that his division represented one of the last remaining cards that German high command could play. But understanding the desperation of his superiors did not make their orders any less insane. The fundamental principles of armored warfare, the lessons that had been written in blood across multiple continents, all emphasized the critical importance of reconnaissance, of understanding the terrain, of knowing where the enemy was positioned and in what strength before committing precious tanks to battle. The officers who gathered around Kempf that morning could see the conflict written across his face. Some of them had served with him for years and could read his moods with the familiarity of old friends. They knew he was being asked to violate his own judgment, to set aside years of experience and training in favor of blind obedience. The younger officers, those who had grown up entirely within the Nazi system and had been taught that willpower could overcome material reality, seemed less troubled. They believed in the superiority of German arms and German soldiers with a fervor that bordered on religious faith. To them, the order made perfect sense. Speed and aggression had won victories before. Why should this be any different? But the veterans knew better. They had seen what happened when tanks were sent forward without proper preparation. They had pulled burned crewmen from shattered vehicles and watched good soldiers die because someone higher up the chain of command had made assumptions rather than gathering facts. The Eastern Front had a way of punishing assumptions. The distances were vast, the terrain treacherous, and the Soviets had shown themselves capable of creating killing zones that could swallow entire formations. Still, orders were orders, and in the German military system of 1943, there was precious little room for independent thinking once Berlin had spoken. The division began its advance in the early morning hours, moving with the mechanical precision that months of training had instilled. The column stretched for miles, a river of steel flowing across the landscape toward objectives that existed only as names on a map. Tank commanders scanned the horizon through their optics, trying to pierce the morning haze and spot any sign of the enemy. Infantry units moved alongside the armor, ready to dismount and clear any resistance. Artillery pieces were towed into position, prepared to provide fire support when the inevitable contact occurred. Everything looked proper, professional, exactly as it should. But beneath the surface discipline, experienced soldiers felt the gnawing unease that comes from moving blind into uncertain ground. The Soviet preparations had begun weeks earlier, long before German High Command had finalized the orders that would send Kempf's division forward. Soviet intelligence had predicted the German movements with uncanny accuracy, not through any mystical foresight but through careful analysis of German doctrine, logistics, and the simple logic of what a desperate enemy might attempt. They knew the Germans would need to advance along certain routes. They knew the terrain would funnel armor into predictable corridors. They knew that if pressure could be applied at the right points, the Germans might be forced to abandon caution in favor of speed. And so they prepared accordingly, with the methodical thoroughness of men who understood they were fighting for their homeland's survival. The position they selected was perfect for what they intended. A natural valley offered what appeared to be an ideal route for armored vehicles, wide enough to accommodate a large formation but bounded by rises on either side that could conceal observers and gun positions. The ground was firm enough to support heavy tanks but not so open that advancing forces would have unlimited freedom of movement. Most importantly, it offered clear fields of fire from elevated positions while limiting the ability of anyone caught in the valley to return fire effectively. Soviet engineers had worked quietly in the pre-dawn hours for days, reinforcing positions, pre-sighting artillery coordinates, establishing communication lines that would allow multiple batteries to concentrate their fire with devastating precision. The anti-tank guns were positioned with particular care. Soviet doctrine had evolved considerably since the early desperate days of the war when raw courage had often substituted for tactical sophistication. Now, gunners understood the importance of crossfire, of waiting for optimal range, of targeting the more vulnerable side and rear armor of German tanks rather than wasting shells against frontal plates. The guns were dug in deep, camouflaged not just with branches and netting but with an understanding of how German reconnaissance would search for threats. Dummy positions drew attention away from real ones. Fire lanes were cleared with subtle care that would not be obvious to aerial observation, had any been conducted. The artillery represented the true killing stroke. Soviet artillery doctrine had always emphasized mass and concentration, but by 1943 it had become refined into something approaching an art form. Multiple batteries had been coordinated to fire on pre-registered coordinates within the valley. The guns were positioned far enough back to be safe from immediate counter-battery fire but close enough to deliver shells with accuracy. Ammunition had been stockpiled in quantities that would allow sustained fire. Most critically, the fire control system had been tested and retested. When the order came, hundreds of shells would arrive within seconds of each other, creating an inferno that would leave nothing alive in the target zone. Kempf's column entered the valley approaches without significant opposition. A few scattered Soviet patrols fell back without offering serious resistance, exactly as they had been ordered to do. The apparent weakness of Soviet defenses should have been a warning, but under pressure to advance quickly and lacking reconnaissance that might have revealed the true situation, German commanders interpreted it as confirmation that they were pushing through a thinly held sector. The tanks increased their pace, eager to exploit what appeared to be an opportunity. Infantry struggled to keep up with the armored vehicles, creating gaps in the formation that would prove catastrophic when the trap was sprung. The first German tanks had penetrated deep into the valley when the Soviet observers, watching from carefully concealed positions on the heights, sent the signal that would unleash hell. The artillery fire arrived with the sound of the world ending. Shells screamed down from the sky in concentrations that defied description, each explosion adding to a crescendo that overwhelmed human senses. The noise alone was enough to induce panic, a physical force that made thought nearly impossible. But the noise was merely the announcement of the destruction that followed. German tanks, caught in the open with nowhere to hide, were torn apart with methodical efficiency. The Soviet gunners had calculated everything perfectly. The shells arrived in patterns that denied any safe zone, any chance for the German armor to disperse or retreat. High explosive rounds created fountains of dirt and metal fragments. Anti-tank shells punched through armor that had been designed to withstand frontal assault but which offered little protection against plunging fire from above. Within the first 60 seconds, a dozen tanks were burning. Within 3 minutes, the valley floor was littered with wrecks, some of them still containing crews who had died before they even understood what was happening. Tank commanders who managed to maintain composure in those first terrible moments tried to organize a response, but they were working against impossible odds. Their radios were filled with screaming voices, damage reports, and the simple repeated word that every soldier dreads hearing. Hit, hit, hit! Attempts to return fire were largely futile. The Soviet gun positions were too well concealed, too dispersed, and protected by terrain that the Germans could not effectively engage from their exposed positions in the valley. Some tanks tried to reverse out of the killing zone, only to find that Soviet planners had anticipated this reaction and adjusted their fire to seal the exits. The anti-tank guns joined the massacre with precise, measured fire. Soviet gunners had been trained to remain calm under pressure, to wait for optimal shots rather than wasting ammunition on hasty firing. They targeted tanks that were trying to maneuver, that were presenting their vulnerable sides, that were clustering together in ways that made them easier to engage. Each shot was a calculation, a judgment about which target would yield the best result. When a gun spoke, more often than not, another German tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches as the crew bailed out or died at their stations. Kempf, monitoring the disaster from a position further back in the column, faced the terrible reality that his division was being destroyed in front of his eyes and there was almost nothing he could do about it. His most elite units, the formations he had counted on to break through Soviet defenses and achieve the breakthrough that Berlin demanded, were being methodically annihilated. The radios brought him reports that grew progressively worse with each passing minute. Entire platoons were gone. Company commanders were dead or their vehicles destroyed. The carefully organized formation that had entered the valley had dissolved into chaos and death. The 5 minutes of concentrated artillery fire accomplished what days of conventional combat might not have achieved. When the barrage finally lifted, the valley floor was transformed. Fires burned across the landscape, fed by fuel from ruptured tanks and ammunition that cooked off in secondary explosions. Bodies lay scattered among the wreckage, some of them blown clear of their vehicles by the force of internal explosions. Survivors, those lucky or unlucky enough to have lived through the bombardment, stumbled through the smoke and confusion, many of them wounded, all of them traumatized by the sheer violence of what they had just experienced. The Soviet infantry, which had remained hidden during the artillery barrage, now emerged to complete the destruction. They moved with confidence, knowing that the German armor had been broken and that the surviving enemy soldiers were disorganized and leaderless. Small arms fire crackled across the valley as Soviet troops engaged German survivors who tried to resist. Some German soldiers, recognizing the futility of continued fighting, raised their hands in surrender. Others, too shocked to make rational decisions or determined to fight to the end, died in brief, one-sided firefights. Kempf was forced to make the hardest decision a commander can face. He ordered the surviving elements of his division to retreat, to abandon the field and the men who had fallen there. The withdrawal was chaotic, conducted under continued Soviet artillery fire that pursued the Germans as they pulled back. Vehicles collided in the confusion. Wounded men were left behind because there was no time and no means to evacuate them. The division that had entered the valley as one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations limped away as a broken shadow of itself, having lost approximately 80% of its armored strength in an engagement that had lasted less time than it takes to boil water for coffee. The human cost was staggering in ways that transcended simple numbers. Tank crews were highly trained specialists, men who had undergone months of education in the operation and maintenance of complex machines. They could not be replaced quickly or easily. The officers who died in the valley represented years of institutional knowledge, men who understood combined arms warfare and who had learned through hard experience how to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery. Their loss would be felt in every subsequent engagement, as less experienced commanders tried to fill roles they were not yet ready to assume. For the broader German war effort, the destruction of Kempf's division represented far more than the loss of one formation. It was a demonstration that Soviet forces had evolved to the point where they could not only defend against German attacks but could do so with a sophistication that turned German advantages into fatal vulnerabilities. The speed and aggression that had won victories in earlier campaigns were now liabilities when employed against an enemy that had learned to anticipate and counter them. The assumption of German tactical superiority, which had underpinned so much strategic planning, was revealed as increasingly questionable. The Soviet commanders who planned and executed the ambush gained confidence from their success. They had proven that careful preparation and intelligent use of terrain could overcome even elite German formations. The lessons learned would be applied in subsequent operations, refined and improved as the Red Army continued its evolution from a force that had nearly collapsed in 1941 into one capable of driving the Wehrmacht back across Eastern Europe. Every German tank destroyed in that valley was one less obstacle between Soviet forces and Berlin. Berlin's reaction to the disaster was predictable. Rather than acknowledging that the hasty orders had contributed to the catastrophe, official reports emphasized Soviet numerical superiority and the unforeseen strength of enemy defenses. Kempf, who had followed orders even while doubting their wisdom, found his career prospects dimmed by association with failure. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had watched the German military system operate under Nazi control. Success was attributed to brilliant leadership from the top. Failure was blamed on inadequate execution by subordinates. The possibility that the strategic and operational decisions themselves might be flawed was never seriously considered by those in power. The veterans who survived the ambush carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They had entered the valley believing in their own skill and the quality of their equipment. They had been taught that German armor was superior, that German tactics were unmatched, that victory was inevitable if they simply maintained their courage and discipline. The reality of being helpless under artillery fire that they could not avoid or counter had shaken those beliefs to their foundations. Some men would never fully recover from the trauma of watching their comrades die while being unable to help them, or even protect themselves. The 5-minute barrage became a case study, though not in the way German high command might have hoped. Soviet military academies analyzed it as an example of proper defensive planning and execution. They studied how intelligence gathering, terrain analysis, artillery coordination, and disciplined fire control could combine to create a killing zone that rendered enemy advantages meaningless. The principles demonstrated in that valley would be applied again and again as Soviet forces pushed westward, each time with increasing refinement and confidence. For the soldiers of both sides who witnessed what happened, the engagement represented something beyond a tactical victory or defeat. It was a glimpse into the industrial horror that modern warfare had become, where human courage and individual skill mattered less than mathematical calculations of trajectory and explosive force. The tankers who died in those 5 minutes were not defeated by better soldiers. They were killed by a system, by procedures and protocols that had been developed specifically to negate the advantages they brought to battle. Their bravery meant nothing against shells that arrived too fast to evade and in concentrations too heavy to survive. The valley itself, scarred by explosions and littered with wreckage, became a monument to the consequences of hubris and haste. Local populations who returned after the war found the burned-out hulks of German tanks slowly rusting into the soil, silent testimony to a morning when the finest products of German industry had been transformed into scrap metal and graves. Some of the wreckage remained for decades, too dangerous or too difficult to remove, a reminder written in steel and earth of what happens when confidence exceeds capability, and when orders are followed despite better judgment. The broader strategic offensive that Kempf's division had been meant to support ultimately failed. The breakthrough that Berlin had demanded never materialized. The war on the Eastern Front, which German leadership had believed could still be won with one more push, one more concentration of force, instead turned definitively against the Reich. The destruction in the valley was both a symptom and a cause of that turning, a moment where the accumulated advantages that Germany had enjoyed earlier in the war finally collided with the accumulated learning and growing strength of Soviet forces. What makes the story of those 5 minutes particularly significant is not just the scale of destruction, but what it revealed about the changing nature of the war. In 1941, German forces had achieved stunning victories through speed, surprise, and superior coordination. By 1943, those same tactics were leading to disasters because the enemy had adapted. The Soviets had learned to use the vastness of their territory not as a weakness but as a strategic depth that allowed them to prepare defenses in layers. They had learned to anticipate German movements and to create situations where German strengths became irrelevant. Most importantly, they had developed the institutional capacity to plan and execute complex operations that required coordination across multiple units and weapon systems. The officers who planned the ambush were not acting on inspiration or luck. They were applying doctrine that had been refined through bitter experience and countless tactical experiments. They had studied German methods, identified vulnerabilities, and created procedures specifically designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. The artillery barrage was not random. It was the culmination of mathematical calculations about blast radius, fragmentation patterns, and the time required for German crews to react and maneuver. The positioning of anti-tank guns reflected deep understanding of armor capabilities and limitations. The entire operation was a demonstration of military professionalism that matched or exceeded anything the Wehrmacht could produce. For Kempf personally, the aftermath was a slow descent into obscurity and recrimination. He had done what he was ordered to do, advancing when commanded despite his misgivings. He had followed the chain of command and subordinated his judgment to that of his superiors. And for this obedience, he would be associated forever with one of the most devastating tactical defeats suffered by German armored forces. The irony was bitter but inescapable. Had he refused the orders, he would have been relieved of command and possibly court-martialed. By obeying them, he presided over the destruction of the division he had worked years to build into an elite fighting force. The men who died in the valley never knew that their sacrifice would accomplish nothing of strategic value. They went forward believing that their advance was necessary, that it was part of a larger plan that would lead to victory. The truth, which became clear only in retrospect, was that they were being sacrificed to maintain the illusion of German offensive capability, to satisfy distant commanders who refused to accept that the initiative on the Eastern Front had passed irreversibly to the Soviets. Their deaths changed nothing except to add more names to the lengthening casualty lists, and more wreckage to the vast graveyard that the Eastern Front had become. What happened in that valley in July 1943 was not unusual for the Eastern Front, where entire armies were destroyed and reformed with a regularity that would have been unthinkable in any previous conflict. But it stands out because of how completely it demonstrated the evolution of Soviet military capability and the corresponding decline of German advantages. 5 minutes was all it took to transform confidence into catastrophe, to turn a division of the Wehrmacht's best into scattered survivors and burning metal. 5 minutes to prove that the war the Germans thought they were fighting had already been lost, even if the final surrender was still 2 years away. The radio message that had started it all, that brief command to advance immediately without reconnaissance, represented everything wrong with German strategic thinking in the latter half of the war. It showed contempt for basic military prudence, indifference to the lives of the soldiers being commanded, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's capabilities. It was the product of a system that valued obedience over competence, and that punished independent thought even when that thought might save lives and preserve irreplaceable resources. And it led, with the terrible logic of cause and effect, to 5 minutes of destruction that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. The survivors carried forward the knowledge that they had been sent into a trap that could have been avoided, that their comrades had died not in fair combat but in a slaughter that resulted from decisions made by men who would never face consequences for being wrong. That knowledge, that understanding of how little their lives mattered to the system they served, would corrode morale and cohesion in ways that no amount of propaganda could repair. The Wehrmacht would continue fighting for nearly 2 more years, but the spirit that had driven its early victories was gone, replaced by a grim fatalism born of too many disasters like the one in the valley. In the end, the 5-minute barrage that destroyed Kempf's division was not just a tactical engagement, or even a significant battle. It was a crystallization of the entire war's trajectory, a moment where all the accumulated mistakes, all the strategic failures, all the consequences of hubris and ideology came together in concentrated form. It proved that technology and training were not enough without intelligence and proper planning. It showed that even the best soldiers could be rendered helpless by an enemy that fought smarter rather than merely harder. And it demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that the German war machine was no longer capable of the kind of victories it needed to achieve its objectives. The tanks burned, the men died, and the war continued its inexorable march toward the conclusion that had become inevitable even before those 5 terrible minutes began.